Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Art Forum SF, co-sponsored by South Asian departments of UC Santa Cruz, Berkeley, and Stanford University, we welcome you all to Sala 2023. The topic for this session is First Country, Our Mothers and Fathers, with our guest speakers, Shobha Tharoor and Kalpana Mohan, who are in conversation with Raji Pillai. Just a few house rules before we begin our session. Please put your phones on silent and no flash photography or recording. Book signing will be in the quad after this session. The session is for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes for Q&A. So with that, let's give our panelists a big round of applause.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear with the fan and everything? Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see a full house at noon, the first session of the day. So wonderful. Thank you. So let me introduce our authors, both Bay Area authors. Shobha Tharoor Srinivasan is the author of a dozen works of fiction and nonfiction. Shobha has published children's books in India and in the US, and has been recognized with awards for many of them. Her poetry book for children, It's Time to Rhyme, won the prestigious Publishing Next Best Book of the Year award in 2022. One of her stories was dramatically performed by Silicon Valley Shakespeare, California. Her books have been included in school curricula in India. A former nonprofit development professional who spent 2 decades as an advocate and fundraiser for persons with disabilities, she's also an award-winning voiceover artist who won the 68th National Film Awards in India for Best Narration Voiceover for the film Rhapsody of Rain's Monsoons of Kerala in 2022. Her latest book, Good Innings, The Extraordinary Ordinary Life of Lily Tharoor, is a tribute to her mother. Please welcome Shobha Tharoor Srinivasan. Kalpana Mohan's writing has appeared in several regional and national magazines in the United States. She is an award-winning columnist for India Currents. She's a regular contributor to various other news outlets which serve the San Francisco Bay Area. She has been selected to be a participant of several writing communities and was featured at the Hyderabad Literary Festival in India in 2020. In fall 2019, her book, Daddykins, a memoir of my father and I, was part of the curriculum in a creative writing course, Uses of Personal Experience at San Francisco State University. Please welcome Kalpana Mohan. So let's set the stage. What I'd like to start with is invite each author to speak about their books and do a little reading. And I will, interject with a few comments, and then we'll go on to more detailed questions, okay? So let's start with names. A lot of people have asked Shobha and Kalpana about the names of their books. Lily, why is her name Lily? Is she Christian? Is she, And then Daddykins, why did you name your book Daddykins? So let's start with that. And let's start with Shobha. The first chapter of her book actually explains this in a beautiful way. And so let me pass the mic on to Shobha to introduce her book and read from it.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I could hear an echo when you were talking, Raji. That's why these mics can be dangerous sometimes. Thank you so much, all of you. I see so many familiar faces. It's such a thrill to be speaking to, actually, as you said, a fairly full hall, especially on a hot Sunday morning. And so I'm very grateful that you've all made the time to come. I just wanted to frame this book a little bit before I read from the first chapter. The book is essentially a single-authored book in that I have written the story of my mother's life. It's not a conventional biography. It does follow the timeline of a biography, but it is essentially a book put together by a reflection of moments of her life. And what I have done in some ways is gather stories about her, with her, my memories of her life, from when she was a child, based on stories I've heard from her siblings, from her as well, and then woven it all together to essentially create a book that is a tribute to a person who is still a grandmother and a great-grandmother, who is still who's still able to enjoy the book. So having said that, I wrote the book with, it's written both in first person as well as in third person, and I thought that was important in some ways because I wanted us to get a sense of her narrating her own story. But then, of course, we also have the third-person narrator. And so when I read the first chapter, you're hearing Lily's voice. And I don't want to speak too much about the book, and it is available outside. But one of the things I wanted to say is, after I had written the book, my daughter, who's a cultural theorist and an English professor, gave me this, described the book, and she said, there's Trin Minha is an academic who talks about speaking nearby. And she says, Mom, you have successfully spoken nearby because you haven't ventriloquized Mummy, but on the other hand, you have spoken about her and in her voice without either talking down to her, and that requires a little intimacy. So just to sort of tell you a little bit about that before I start reading. So you will hear in the first chapter, the opening of the book introduces Lily's thoughts to us. Sorry, should have put a clip on this. Apologies. And the chapter is called Believe in Yourself. My father was tall and handsome, and he was known throughout the village as the person to whose address copies of National Geographic magazine and Reader's Digest arrived from abroad with regularity. This was not a usual practice in the village, where most residents spoke and read only Malayalam. My father was a teacher of history and geography at Raja's High School, and he was very well respected in the community. His name was Karat Theyunni Menon, and he was born in 1900, the first year of the new century. There were other stories I remember hearing as well, stories of how my father had said that he would only marry after he had his own house. He had grown up in a household of many members, many voices, and many different opinions, and hoped never to bring his own wife back into such a joint family where she may not have had the decision-making opportunities of running a home. My father's approach to life and living was very modern for the times, and it was expanded by his reading. He was also determined not to start his married life in his wife's Tharavad, as was customary in the Nair community with its Marumukatayam. I remember my mother telling me that the alliance between her and her husband was made very carefully. Katie Menon was selected by Jayashangani's Valyamaman, Ramankutti Menon, who was the eldest male member of the Tharavad and thus the Karanavar, with important decision-making powers. In fact, Valyamaman was called Adhikari Mama by his family members. He was my grandmother's brother and my mother's uncle. Katie Menon was thought to be a suitable match because of the pedigree of his Tharavad, because he was an educated man, and because of his fine features. His economic status and family wealth were not important, as my mother, Mundarath Jayashangani Menon of Elavanjeri, was a woman of sufficient means. With his school teacher's salary, my father bought the house that he wanted in Collingwood. He named it Lily Cottage. In his mid-30s, he married my much younger mother, the privileged daughter of the well-known Mundarath Tharavad, with her long, black, shiny hair and her quick wit and sharp tongue. And when I was born, first of their 9 children, fair like him and delicate like a flower, He called me Lily, even though the official name on my birth certificate was Sulekha. I was his favorite child. He was my hero. I'm just going to read a little bit to show you how we transition from the first person to the third. Lily was born in the small town of Kollangod in Palakkad district, Kerala, on 2nd December 1935. The British called the place Kalingudi, or the town of Kollans. Kollangod was an unspoiled, beautiful small town, and like many areas in Kerala, surrounded by fields of rice paddy and dotted with coconut-laden palm trees. But the town was distinct from other small towns in the area because of the royal family who continued to live there and the folklore that informed its stories.
Thank you, Shobha. What a lovely beginning to a book. So Palakkad, the beautiful district in Kerala that Shobha was just talking about, where Lily was born, was also where Daddykins, Kalpana Mohan's father, was born. So this is a very Kerala-centric panel, by the way, because I am also born in Kerala and grew up in Bengal, like Shobha. So Kalpana will tell you about her book before she reads from it. But in addition to Daddykins, who is a delightful character and very moving and poignant, she has also sketched a really interesting and unforgettable character. His name is Vinayagam, and she's drawn him with many flourishes. He's kind of an unexpected star of this book for me. He is kind of Daddykins' housekeeper, caregiver, driver, and Man Friday all in one. And so, their conversations are just delightful. Vinayagam will sometimes just lob one over the net, and Daddykins will just smash it back. And the reader just sits there giggling, So, Kalpana, I would love it if you would please read from a bit of the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. And I just wanted to give you an idea of how the book began. First of all, the book was born on Facebook. I went to India in 2012 when my son left home to go to college. I thought this was a good time to go home and spend time with my father, who had been widowed about 8 years prior, in 2005, when my mother passed away after suffering from cancer. So Dad was very alone, except for the chauffeur who came into my parents' lives in 1995. And Vinayakam basically became everything my mother was. He took over the prayer room, he took over the kitchen. Aside from driving, he had to go do the grocery shopping and all of that. He filled in for my mother in many ways. So Dad's life was very good. He was working full-time, by the way. My brother-in-law got him into his company, a financial securities company. So Dad was 82 when he was widowed, but he was working full-time pretty much until 16 weeks before he passed away at the age of almost 90. So Dad had a very full life, but in 2012, when I was all poised to go to India and spend time with him, before that, I also want to say my only other sibling, Urmila, lives in Singapore. She is 11 years older than I am. She would visit on and off, but she had grandma duties, and I was free. So I decided to go spend time with Dad when I found out that he had a pancreas, a tumor in the pancreas. While it was not malignant, he decided that he did not want to go through any invasive procedure. And from that point on, about fall of 2012 to 2014, he passed away on Father's Day, we were watching the slow vanishing of my father. He basically died being unable to eat. So I want to read, every chapter of my book has a vignette, which was something that I had written on Facebook. So I begin with a vignette under a chapter called The Things They Carried to Lahore. Vinayagam called my father's night watchman a humorless clod and hissed at him at every opportunity. I don't see why we need watchmen, sir, he said to Daddykins one morning. Just last Monday, when I returned late after dropping off Urmila Amma at the airport, watchman was snoring. I jiggled the gate and the padlock and cried out his name. Then I simply climbed over the gate. Watchman lay there like a roll of carpet. Sir, nothing will wake up watchman, sir, not even a bomb from Pakistan. Okay? So now I go to the end of the chapter where I give you an idea of the kind of guy he was. For those people who have cared for their parents back in India with all sorts of help at home, there's always a power struggle between the help at home. So you'll get a flavor for that here. Vinayagam complained about every one of my father's retinue of household help. The cook was always under surveillance. He snooped on Ganga, the maid, like a hawk, although she snipped his tail when she got the chance. Another young man known to our family, Saravanan, cared for my father at night just so Daddykins didn't fall and hurt himself. Vinayagam supervised him too. Vinayagam was just always on high military alert. Now, his eternal vigilant state was impinging on my father's need for privacy. Following Daddykins' return from the hospital, Vinayagam expected to be informed about every minutiae of my father's alimentary health, because he varied the old man's diet depending on how his stomach was doing on a given day. Vinayagam was trying to help, but Daddykins lamented that he had become a prisoner in his own home. I sensed his vexation. He was being stripped of his dignity by the people closest to him just because he wasn't as physically agile as he used to be. Aging and ill health had made public the most private of his bodily functions. I remember the morning Vinayagam followed him to the bathroom door, asking him what he was going to do inside. I will not know, Daddykins shot back, until I see what exactly I go. He banged the door shut behind him and fired verbal artillery from inside. I don't have the freedom to go to the bathroom in my own damned house. Vinayagam parked himself right outside the bathroom door. What are you doing, sir? He asked once again. He asked Daddykins whether his boss had done the small job, 1, or the big job, 2. When at last Daddykins came out of the bathroom and his man Friday accosted him yet again, my father poised himself for a few seconds on the bathroom mat. 1.5. Daddykins shot back as he pulled the bathroom door shut and marched through the bedroom door to his rust-orange sofa in the living room. Thank you.
Isn't that delightful? So many gems in this book like that. So let's talk a little bit more about Daddykins and about Lily. So let's stay with Daddykins for a minute, since he's fresh in your minds. Would love to hear from you, Kalpana, about his early days in Palakkad, growing up, his childhood, and perhaps, what you have shared as a defining moment in his early adulthood that kind of, perhaps set the stage for the rest of his life.
So my father was born in 1923 in a place called Chennimale, which is between Kerala and it's close to Coimbatore. As the eldest son of 7 children, of 4 boys and 3 girls, he had a lot of responsibilities. And in those days, people from Kerala would go all over India to work. And my grandfather did not find work in Palakkad. He was a teacher. And he ended up, after trying several positions locally, he ended up going to Dahod in Gujarat. So for 33 years, my grandfather worked in Dahod and returned home just twice a year. So the responsibility of running the household fell on his mother, who was an asthmatic, but largely fell on my father and his brother just below him. So he had a very hard life. I mean, it was, life was, poverty was a given in the villages or agraharams of Palakkad. And he looked up to other people. My grandfather's brother was really the man who ran the house while he lived in Palakkad. And my father always was frustrated by the fact that he didn't have a choice in whom he married. He had a wonderful 6 decades with my mother, but when it came to making a decision about whom he should marry, his Periyappa, that is his father's elder brother, told my father that he had found the girl for him. And she had a round face. That's it. Literally, that was the only description given to him. And when my father protested, he basically asked him, what do you want? I mean, do you want to marry a movie star? Sort of thing. I really felt that for my father, that was one moment, defining moment, because he had no control over the situation. And I think following that, at every point, he felt that he should make a decision for himself. So the other thing you had asked me a question about the name Daddykins. I just wanted to address that. I called him by a name that I really would rather not share here. But when I asked my daughter and son what I should call him, they said that I should use the suffix from what they called him, which was Tatakins, Tata being grandfather in Tamil. So that is how it became Daddykins. So.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kalpana. So let's talk about Lily. So Shobha's book is the slim, lovely book that is kind of a combination of a memoir, and details of the life of her, amazing mother, as well as some kind of life lessons that Shobha weaves into the book. And I think the strength of Lily's character comes through, and I want to invite Shobha to speak a little bit about how her childhood kind of made her into the person that she became and still is.
Me or my mother's childhood?
I'm sorry, your mother's childhood.
My mother's childhood. Okay. As I said, this sort of a little backdrop. My father died at a very early age. He was in his early 60s. He was a larger-than-life character, much beloved, humorous, twinkle in his eyes, lit up the room when he walked in. And there's enough sort of support and tribute of him, when we were growing up. And in fact, I have friends who've said, why didn't you write about your father and not your mother? And I think that's precisely why I wrote about my mother. Women... So many. My mother's story, what's interesting for me now that I've discovered, I wrote the book over a year ago. It was a pandemic exercise. It is as I said, it's based on my reflections of her life, her visits to us, our visits to her, and the incredible force. As you said about your father, he didn't have the autonomy to choose his own wife, but he felt, you said, in some ways it informed who he became, and he always wanted to be in control of his life. Well, my mother obviously also grew married at a time in Kerala, in Palakkad district. She saw my father's photograph. The family elders said he was a suitable man, and he liked the look of her in her photograph, and that's how these things happen. And I think he flew down a couple of weeks before the wedding, and they got to meet, and she served him a cup of tea or something, and that's how these things happen. But when she lost my father, and rather even before that, I think a lot of that sort of inner confidence manifests itself. And the book, in some ways, half the book at least is after he passed away, and it's the incredible things, the journeys she's had. You said what made her what she was. The fact that she was called Lily and they lived in a home called Lily Cottage is in a sense an affirmation of your sthanam, as they say, your position in the home. She was always her father's pet. And he was a very beloved man in the village because at that time, not very many people spoke English. And as I said, he subscribed to American and British publications. He spoke and read English. He was a school teacher. And at night, he would be sitting out on the front stoop translating for a lot of people who would get, who needed to write an official letter or, like it happens. We've seen this in other villages as well, I'm sure. He was the man, the sort of resident scribe, the resident scholar, if you call it that. And so, she had that sense of confidence of being the elder child of that kind of man. So, you grow up with the sense of both strength and security. She was a very quiet child, but a very driven person right from the start. She went to a co-ed school. She was a head girl. She auditioned for a part in a Kathakali performance, and in those days, all roles were done by men. Whether it's, you're playing Draupadi or somebody else, it's usually men who do the dance. And my mother did play Draupadi Panjali in one of the shows, and evidently people talked about it for years afterwards, and she did a very good job. So in some ways, she was sort of a rule breaker, and we'll see signs of her rule breaking in many ways. I mean, many years later, when my father brought her back, and because of his job, they were members of Bombay Gymkhana in Bombay, she went to the club wearing trousers with a sari blouse. And a lot of the socialites there sort of looked at her disdainfully and raised their eyebrows and said, oh, well, are you setting a new fashion? And, she didn't say very much about it, but the reality is, she said later on she saw a lot of people wearing that kind of outfit. So there you are.
That's great. That actually feeds nicely into my next question for both Shobha and Kalpana, and let's stay with Lily for a minute. So she, and this is about kind of changing the narrative, which is the theme of this conference. So Lily was born in this village in Palakkad, and then she, got married and went to Kolkata, and before she knew it, she was off to London. And then she came back to Bombay. And so, I'd like to invite Shobha to talk about her journey from, how she kind of transformed herself from this village girl to this cosmopolitan woman. And especially in London, she didn't have English at the time, and how she taught herself English by listening to the radio. So it's, very, very driven woman. And then we'll come to Daddykins and his journey out of Palakkad to Madras and Lahore, etc. So please.
Well, that is true. My mother came with a maidservant to Kolkata. When she got married, my father had already spent about 9 years, I think, in London, and he had decided he was going to come home and pick up a job in Calcutta. He was going to be working for the Amrita Bazar Patrika, and so that's what he had announced to his family and to his bride-to-be, that he was coming back and they were going to start life in Calcutta. So she came, and her mother sent her off probably with pickles and foods and the maid and all of that, and she got married, so the newness of a husband and a new place, and she'd never left the village before. She comes to Calcutta, and within a few days of arriving in Calcutta, my father got news from his former employer in London saying, there's another gig come up, do you want to come back? And he thought that would be a great experience for my mother, so he said, let's go. And she didn't even have a passport. She could barely speak any English. I mean, you learn English to read and write in school, but conversational English wasn't really her cup of tea in those days. Anyway, later she had tea with Mountbatten and probably had to have a sentence or two. But they got a passport, they had to send the maid back, and all of that was sort of a stressful time for my mother. She went to London and she didn't know how to cook, she didn't know how to clean, she sat in this tiny little room when she'd grown up in a larger place, and my father would go off to work every morning, and so there's a lot of description of that. But what was interesting is, even at that time, she realized that language was very important if you needed to be a little independent. She did not want to be dependent on her working husband. And so she listened to Desert Island Discs, which is a fabulous series. And curiously, while writing this book, I have really become addicted to Desert Island Discs. I had heard an occasional episode, but now so often when I go for a walk, I listen to it, and I highly recommend it to you. But of course, at the time my mother was listening to it, it was this gentleman called Roy Plumley, and she would, even today in her sweet accented English, my mother will give you the signature line that Roy Plumley uses, which unfortunately I can't remember, but something like, come and listen to the stories of da-da-da-da-da, whatever. So she memorized these sentences that was on the radio, and that's how she began to speak English, really.
Thank you. Yeah. So, Kalpana, you spoke a little bit about how Daddykins changed his narrative. Kind of, he decided after that shocking experience of being told who he was going to marry, that he was going to, control his own destiny, if you will. So he went from there to Lahore and to Africa. So tell us a little bit about those journeys.
So in 1956, my dad sought an opportunity in Pakistan, and that was also because something had happened in his life in 1952 when he lost his first child, Nirmala, to smallpox. He was working in Bangalore, and I think that was such a low point in my parents' lives that they wanted to do something different, and I believe all of those things informed their choice to go to Lahore. But Dad always was the kind to seek opportunities elsewhere. And if you think about how mine was a Tambram family, so a Palakkad Iyer family, which was, we were stuck in the old ways. My grandparents lived with us in India for a large part of the time, and my paternal grandparents, my maternal grandparents were extremely conservative. So for the eldest child of a family to leave the country was a very big deal. I think we had gone past the Kala Pani fears and all of that, but there was still this thing that you didn't want to send your eldest child out, just in case something happened to you, right? And my dad still sought the opportunity, went to Lahore for 2 years, and the very act of going itself was so scary for my parents, I think, because they had 22 items going on with them. They traveled for 3 days from Madras to Delhi, and from Delhi to Amritsar, and apparently they missed the train going from Amritsar to Lahore, and that meant that at the last minute, they had to jump into a taxi. And Dad always says how harrowing that was. My sister was born by then, so she has these wonderful memories of life in Lahore, and my dad would always say how my sister was speaking Punjabi and Hindi and all of that then. My mother, on the other hand, was so different from Lily. She was scared to learn Hindi or Punjabi, and she would not go to many of the events that my dad took my sister to. So I just wanted to highlight how people can be very different, and that's what struck me when I read Good Innings. So in 20 or so years later, in 1972, when my dad had conducted the marriage of my sister in Chennai, Madras then, Dad was broke. And in order to make more money, he sought an opportunity in Europe, and he looked, Tehran was also one he was considering, but he found this opportunity to work in the government of Tanzania as an accountant. So he took that opportunity, and I was 11 years old. And even at that point, my grandparents were very old. And so it was rather scary for him to take that opportunity for 5 years. But Dad always felt that it would be a great opportunity for his wife and for me. And when we came back, he had made the money to buy his first car. So that was a very big deal.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move on from that to parenting styles. We'll start with Lily and Daddykins, and then move on to kind of more contemporary, us as Bay Area parents. So I'd love to hear from you and tell the audience, how were each as parents to you? And as you grew older, how did your view of them change? So for example, let's start with Shobha and Lily. Shobha, you and your sister were Amul babies. Did you all know that? The original Amul baby is sitting right next to me. And then they were beauty queens. And Lily's hand is strong in all of this, pushing them to do various things. And your brother, Shashi, was a prominent figure in the UN and is now a prominent figure in Indian politics, was the first child, and a little bit you and your sister were perhaps in his shadow. So speak of Lily's parenting.
So, I guess it's fair to say that my mother was I don't want to call her a tiger mom, but she was definitely an ambitious woman. And I think she put a lot of that kind of ambition and I don't want to use pressure either, because I never felt pressured growing up, but she was not easily satisfied, and that is the truth. But every parents are, if you're fortunate to have both your father and mother alive at the same time, when you're growing up, my father was the sort of person who took great pleasure in almost anything we did. So we always had that balance, If I wrote a poem or wrote a story, he would get all excited and send it off to a newspaper or something, and give us that kind of affirmation. My mother, on the other hand, would say, "Well, that's good, but so and so did this and this," So there was the balance of that, but because she gave so much of her time, she was not a working mother in the sense outside the home. She worked at home, but she had the privilege of my father's job. So that comes later, is that, when your sole income provider is your spouse and you lose a spouse, how much the rug is pulled out from under your feet. And she recognized that because my father had his first heart attack at the age of 37. So I think a lot of her disquiet, her ambition, her what you might call pushiness, also came from that insecurity. She felt that somehow she had been given an opportunity to transcend and leave the world of the village to make a new life for herself, and she wanted to make sure that the children took full advantage of it. So yes, hers was an involved parenting style. It was a style that was very, very driven, but there was glee in it. I'll give you just one quick example, and then you can answer the same question. But I remember in Calcutta, when it rained, the roads would get completely flooded. It's the truth. And I think it still happens, but I haven't been back in a while. And, we loved Cal, but Cal is when, I was from the age of about 10 to 18, I was in Calcutta, so that's sort of my formative years. If Mummy said, "Let's go and see a movie," and we got in the car, because luckily we had a car and driver because of my father's job, so we had that privilege. We'd get in the car to go to the movie, my sister and myself and my mother, and the car would get stuck in the road because it was flooded. If she has promised us we're going to the movie, she'd get out of the car, she'd hitch up her sari, she'd hold our hands, and we would make it to the movie. Whereas my father or another parent may have said, no, the road is stuck, this, that, let's go back home. So we always saw her as a doer, as someone who had that kind of chutzpah about life and about opportunity, who encouraged us to sort of not turn away just because there was an obstacle, but to sort of power through. So that is, in a sense, her parenting style. Did I answer your question, yes. Or did you say my style? No.
No. Yeah. We'll come to their styles in a bit. So Lily, literally, they were going to the movies come hell or high water, and high water came, right? So, Kalpana, wanted to invite you to talk about Daddykins as a parent, and also about societal norms, generational differences. You grew up with several norms in a Tamil Brahmin family. Then when you were older, you had conversations about caste with your father around the business of having only a Brahmin cook prepare your meals. So talk about him as a parent and that particular.
So dad was, I guess, like your mother, Shobha. While my mother was very much someone who, was more about the kitchen and the house. She was an amazing housekeeper and has informed how I am today. My father was the one who, wanted me to take part in quizzes, write, and do all the things that girls must do in school. He was always after me, but he was also ambitious for me in the way he wanted to be ambitious for me. For instance, he decided when we returned from Tanzania that I should only study the sciences, as all parents in South India who wanted their children to be engineers or doctors. Dad got me admission in physics. But guess what? I go into college on the day of enrollment, and I switch it to English literature. So Dad was one of those guys who had dreams for me. I remember I came out of my bachelor's degree, and he said, now you should try for IAS, right? In the 70s, that was a thing everybody had to do. But guess what? I did not have a language. While I could read and write Tamil, I spent 6 years in Tanzania, so that got me out of an Indian language. I was doing French at the time. So that was out, but then he made me write all sorts of exams. And in those days, you sat for exams conducted by State Bank and all of these things, and then the insurance services exams and so on. And I did become an officer in United India Insurance, to satisfy my dad. But I had also got a diploma in journalism. Dad was always thrilled that I wrote, and until his last day on earth, his dream was that I should publish a book. But it was not to be. I had begun working on it as he was dying, but it was published only after he passed away. So Dad was a dreamer for me, for sure. As far as the other question is concerned, as I said, we grew up in a very, very traditional family. When women were, had their periods, we actually did not go into the kitchen. We didn't touch things in the house. So I was subjected to all of that in my early years. And Dad was very particular. In fact, when he served me food, the joke was it would drop down from a helicopter. We followed all of those norms. And when I told my children that in this country, oh no, my daughter has never been conformist at all. But we have discussions about it, and she wants a scientific explanation for everything, of course. I hope I've addressed all of that.
That's great. So let's talk, we're moving into your opinions and kind of, our generation's parenting style. So, we are Bay Area, all three of us are Bay Area South Asian parents. And, how has parenting changed from when you grew up? And, we learn as much from our children as we do from our parents. And Kalpana put it very beautifully. She said, her children have always held her to the light. And I feel that way about my own daughter, Sunaina, who's here today, 18. She and I have had a lot of discussions about, when is it appropriation and when is it appreciation? If a non-Indian person wears a bindi, what is that if a non-Indian person wears a sari? So what's that? Is it a fuzzy line? Is it a hard line? So we discussed that, and I learned from her because I think she has, the new generation has a clarity of thought from their experiences in this country, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. So Shobha, tell us about, how you are as a parent and how maybe it contrasts and is similar to how Lily was as a parent to you.
Well, I'm sure we're informed quite a bit by, our own childhood and the parenting styles that we've been sort of introduced to or have honed our own skills with. But nobody's born with a parenting manual. And being a parent is something that you learn and you discover. And the children articulate their own personalities and certainly inform how you deal with them. I came away to America as a teenager, as an undergraduate, and marriage happened later, but I had my children early. I had my daughter is now a professor of English in the university, and she is, I would say, my strongest critic and my most beloved muse. My son is here in the auditorium. I don't know whether he came reluctantly or he came to support me, but he's here. So, we haven't seen the misery memoirs yet. Hopefully they won't come out. But how has my parenting style been? I know for a fact that I mean, there may be friends of mine who'd say that I was a rather over-enthusiastic parent. I was, I am. I'm still sort of interested in being engaged in their lives, but they do push back sometimes. Some of these old habits die hard. You do, of course, learn a lot from your children. I'm learning every day. Ours, I would like to say, was a parenting where I didn't ever tell them to do anything without telling them why I asked them to do whatever it is I asked them to do. So in other words, there was, even if it wasn't a scientific explanation, there was never a no because it's a no coming from mom. It was a no because there are reasons for why it's a no. And, you'd have one child perhaps picking that up more comfortably than the other, but, children will push back, and they do. And I remember when my daughter initially started questioning things I said, I sort of exulted in a feminist pride of having this bright young girl who had these wonderful questions. But you have to then take a seat back as a parent. And then once your children are adults, it's really a wonderful companionship more than it is a parent-child relationship. So anyway, as I said, if the misery memoirs come out, then you'll know. But I think we've done okay so far.
I will admit I was a stage mom. And I was a bit of a tiger mom with my children. But I think in my case, it stemmed out of not being able to do the things that I wanted to do. Dad had little money in the years that I was growing up until we departed for Tanzania. Life was difficult, and I wanted to learn Bharatanatyam in the 70s and 60s, and Dad said, "Baby, there isn't enough money, but you sing well, so we should put you in music, but that's about all." So I told myself that when I had children, I would expose them to every possible thing that I could, and our son is a musician, our daughter is a dancer, both of them were violinists. So I really pushed them in every direction, and unlike Shobha, I do expect to a misery memoir one day. And my daughter talks about how one day she'll be writing a book. So, yeah.
Wonderful. So you've written about your mother, and Kalpana, you about your father. Tell us about the other parent in each of the books. So Shobha, talk a bit of your memories of Chandran Tharoor, and Kalpana, tell us a little more. You already did a bit, but your memories of your mother.
Well, as I said, Dad was a very beloved man. He was kind-hearted, he was loving, he was friendly, he had a little mischief in him, he was the light of the party, everybody loved him. And it was, so Mum was always the one that people, they talked about how she looked good or she set the fashion, but her steely strength was never really recognized. And I don't want to take away from my father. We grew up, unfortunately, under the shadow that he was not healthy. And maybe my mother sort of blew that up a little bit, but it is also true that he had his first heart attack when he was 38 years old. And it was a massive, massive heart attack. He was in the hospital for many weeks, 6 weeks. And I do remember, I think for the first time, my mother feeling that, oh my God, if anything should happen to Dad, I don't even have a college degree. She got married straight after school, and she thought she had 3 exceptional children, especially my brother, And she thought we would have to go back to the village because I could never get a job. So that insecurity sort of buoyed a lot of her adventure, her reaching out. She even went and did a correspondence course and did her +2. She learned to drive before my father had his heart attack, but she was always trying her best to sort of either educate herself or push her children towards other achievements. And you talked about the beauty contest. She always says it wasn't a beauty contest, it was a personality contest. And my girls had good personality. But the reality is, I think she sort of, it is true, pushed us to do that when we weren't even particularly interested, because she felt that, she'd been reading her magazines, Feminas and Eve's Weeklies and all of that, and she thought that, getting in the limelight by winning something is actually a way to open the doors to other opportunities, right? I mean, well, if you could be Miss Aishwarya Rai and join the movies, or you could be something else. So, it was that kind of aspiration that sort of pushed her towards some of the directions she did. But she also had this huge, unflinching sort of notion that her kids were capable. I mean, every city, she didn't know anybody, she would march to the radio stations and say, you need to give my children a chance. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And, she came to America. She used to come all the time to see me after my father passed away. We took turns going. And my mother came on her own. We didn't send her own ticket or anything. She just came. She would spend months with me because I had a daughter. The other children had sons. And not that she didn't love her, grandsons, but Ragini was her precious because it was the only girl. And so she used to come and spend a lot of time with us. And in many ways, she's probably closer to my son than she is to the other boys because she spent more time with us over the years. And in that sense, I think I'm the right one to write this book. But I'll tell you this quick example. Where we lived, there were these free magazines we get. In the old days, we used to get these, like Cupertino Times, Evergreen Times. And, so she would go for walks and pick up these things from outside, wherever it is that they're lying around. And she pointed out a contest for Mother's Day to my daughter and said, why don't you write a poem or a story about your mother? And so even though this is not me, my mother, the grandmother, told my daughter to write a story, and she wrote the story, and then she won, and she got 4 tickets to Raging Waters and took her family for a trip. Same thing, she came and she saw that Ragini was subscribing to American Girl magazine. I don't know if any of you know that magazine. Is it still around? So guess what? My mother said, there's no Indian girl in the paper dolls. Why don't you write to them and ask if they want an Indian girl? And this is what I mean, luck would have it. My daughter is the Indian American paper doll. Now, she has that claim to fame, and I give my mother credit for that.
Wow, I remember seeing that.
Sorry, the mic. I just wanted to say this is the last question I have posed to our wonderful panelists, and so if you have questions, please think about them, and as soon as Kalpana is done speaking, we'll invite you to ask your questions.
Thanks, Raji. A couple of things about my mother. One of the things is focus. My mother paid attention to everything very deeply. So there is a dish called a more korambu in Tamil Nadu and in Kerala. Once you've made it and you've added yogurt to it, you've got to watch it very keenly. And you see one bubble, you've got to stop turn off the stove. My mother would say, in cooking and in everything else, you've got to watch how you're doing something, because the second your attention wanders, you've spoiled it. So it's that sort of perfectionism that she instilled in me, in everything, in how I groomed myself, in how I wrote. It informs everything I do. But there was one other thing that really shows how she was. There wasn't a single time in my father's memory, in my sister's memory, or mine, when my mother was satisfied with a sari that she purchased at a store. She would go back. Yet again, she would exchange it for another, and a third, and a fourth. So much so that my father said, if it were possible at all, she would have exchanged her husband for several others. So that's the sort of person I lived with until 2005. Thank you.
I see a question already. Jaya, please. I'll repeat the question just so you know, so that it gets into the recording.
I don't think I need the mic. I just want to ask, thank you for the engaging discussion. Shobha and Kalpana, what were some of the challenges you faced while writing your books?
So the question is, what were some of the challenges each writer faced while writing the book?
Shall I go ahead? Sure, please. Well, as a writer for children, though I can't really say I've not written for adults because I've written columns, articles. I wrote for the college newspaper. I worked for almost 20 years in development and wrote grants. And so, I mean, the ability to write different kinds of things was not the challenge. But to write about a living parent, to be sort of intimate and affectionate, but not ventriloquizer, was a bit of a challenge. But, you know, what I did is, rather than go around interviewing everybody and writing a book, I approached the book from a perspective of teachable moments in her life, because in many ways, that is my mother, you know, even the aphorisms in this book are the way she thinks. You know, she would say you can't she wouldn't say that specific quote, but the notion you can't cross the seas merely by looking at it. So this is her kind of thinking, and her favorite writers, you know, I mean, or favorite film stars, you know, whether it's Sophia Loren or somebody else, the kind of language that they've used, the quotes that she lived by these aphorisms in many ways. So the book is her voice without it actually being her voice. And once I figured out how to frame the book, the writing wasn't so hard. So I say that even about children's books. I think in your head, you've got to come to an idea of how you wish to frame a book. Once you've framed it, the writing doesn't become very hard. So today, Jaya, the book is sort of an aid memoir for my mother. And I'm sad to have to say that. I don't say that she's become entirely forgetful, but she's not what this book sort of describes, in that she's slowed down considerably since this book came out. When it first came out, which was a year ago, she was better than she is today. Today, she's much more, she's less likely to forward WhatsApp messages. She's less likely to look at YouTube. She very often will read the book to sort of remember some of these details. So as I said, it's been and I am myself at a particular stage of my life. You know, I'm a grandmother now, and no longer the young child, sort of reflecting on some of these things. So it's more than a challenge, it's been quite a moving experience.
So there were a couple of things, Jaya. One of them was how to interleave the past and the present. Because when I workshopped the book with my group here in Menlo Park, they found it rather boring when I started with the time my father was born and went on with that until today. And so I realized they figured that the way to tell it would be to make it matter in the present. So that is why I begin the book with Daddykins could not eat, and how in 2 weeks from that point, while the squirrels were gorging on mangoes in the yard, my father was passing away, sort of thing. So interleaving the past and present really mattered. So the other point that I wanted to say was the struggles of corroborating what my father said. I had to while I interviewed my father without even realizing that I was going to be writing a book about him. In 2011, December, my father was in a slump. He was very depressed, and I decided that I would talk to him every day for about 6 weeks. And those interviews informed my book. But I didn't want to take that, as it were. So I decided to interview all my aunts. So the only people alive in his family were the three sisters. And I decided to do a lot of research on my own. I also talked to my father's cousins and so on, and my cousins. So just getting the facts right was important, because I've been told very often, and this is true in fiction also, that if you get one fact wrong, it really stops you in the reading process. So.
Yes.
Thank you for this session. It brought back memories of our own parents, and so that's a nice experience. I wanted to ask you, as you look at your mothers and look at your daughters or your children, how has your idea of what feminism is changed, or what are your reflections on the next generation? What are the challenges and the possibilities?
Okay, so to repeat the question is, at this stage, how does each writer reflect on feminism and what it means for the next generation?
That's an interesting question. Well, in some ways, my mother, for her generation, was a feminist. She lived life by her rules, and she had a very liberal husband for that generation who gave her the space to do what she wanted. And so she did live, as I said, a very different kind of life than many of the people around her. She also did return every sari that was given, by the way. So I don't know whether this sort of disquiet and discontent is part of that generation, but I remember keeping gifts my husband gave me, even though I didn't like it, because I said, I'm not going to do what mommy did, it's so mean. Every birthday, she would go and return the sari that she was given. Anyway, so we grew up with a notion that women could do whatever any man could, definitely. That's a very simple way of explaining equality and gender-based differences. But having a daughter is enough to teach you. And I came to America, as I said, as a teenager. So I was sort of I lived in a house with two women in graduate school. And there were some things, for instance, I didn't know. And we don't really need to get into all of that, but they would educate me about things. We had fairly protected lives. I hadn't even crossed the street on my own almost when I came to America as an undergrad. I still remember arriving and expecting somebody to take my suitcases up in the dorm and realizing there's nobody to take it up for you. Those are quick ways of learning. But if you have confidence in yourself and the ability to do what you want, I mean, there's no way that you're going to think you're less capable than anyone else. So that informs my feminism.
Yeah, and I do want to add to that. My mother was, while she was a very traditional person, she had very strong beliefs, and my father had to fall in line. And I had an arranged marriage, and that is he's the 10th man I met. And my father settled several times during the course of the hunt for a husband for me, but my mother would not settle, and she would always tell me, no way you're going to settle. And so I think that itself, being able to make your choice. Well, some days I have some doubts about him, but yeah.
What a wonderful end. Actually, we are out of time, and so may I suggest that if you have other questions for Kalpana and Shobha, please feel free. I think there's going to be a book signing after this. Kepler's should have their books set up. So please feel free. Thank you so much.